Good evening and welcome here to 5 by 15 online tonight with a great guest of ours who's been on 5 by 15 before, Oliver Burkeman, who is the author of the fantastically successful 4,000 Weeks and has now come out with a wonderful new book called Meditations for Mortals. Now, anyone who reads The Guardian, which I suspect is quite a lot of our audience, will have followed Oliver's extraordinary journalism over the years, which he applied a really keen journalistic sensibility towards the questions of self-help, what we could do to make life just generally better. And out of that, of course, came the first remarkable book, which led to the second. Now, first of all, we're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have questions. So please post them. And I'm sure that a lot of you feel like me about Oliver's writing, which is that you find the bit that applies to you and then you think, he's writing this book or this piece just for me. And I'd like to ask him this. So please don't hesitate. All the books, the details will be in the chat. And of course, they're always available from newer books. So Oliver, please switch your machine on and please join us. Thank you so much for being here. First of all, let's start with talking about how this book has kind of emerged off the back of 4,000 Weeks. And it's a curious book in that I'm not really quite sure how I would describe it because it's got a very individual and interesting structure. So maybe you could just talk us through how you came to think of it and why and how it built on 4,000 Weeks.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be back tonight. Yeah. I mean, I could definitely give, and maybe I will soon, like the sort of cerebral philosophical story about how I experienced this book coming along after the last one. But there's another way of talking about it, which is just that I was incredibly aware, and have been for a while, that, it's possible to have a really clear grasp of like how you want to live and how you want to approach your work and your relationships and all of these things, and just like not actually do it repeatedly day after day in life. And so, the sort of self-critical account of this was sort of coming off the back of 4,000 Weeks, realizing, and I think this was true for some readers as well, right, that there was a sort of a interesting vision of how to approach life coming out of that. And we get other philosophies from other sources, of course. It's not just that. And then like, yeah, but how do you actually do the things? So I think this book for me is about that, crossing that gap from knowing to doing. And yeah, as if you want to talk about the structure of the book, that was my attempt to sort of not just write a book about actually doing things, but write a book that could somehow, in its very sort of structure and how people might use it, help cross that gap.
But it also has time involved, doesn't it? Because it's about doing something, or really can read it as a book that you do something every day that just takes a little quirky sideways look at how you're doing things and reassures you.
Yeah, so yeah, just quickly for anyone who's interested, right? It's divided into 4 weeks. Each week has 7 short chapters. They sort of build on each other. It's like meant to be a journey. And yeah, the invitation, I think that's the word that I use, is that you could read a chapter a day for 28 days. It's a book about, in many ways, about loosening our attempts to control reality. So it would be unseemly for me to sort of really insist that people followed a certain way of reading it. But I think it's useful to have that kind of rhythm in mind, even if you don't happen not to follow it, right? And really the idea there was that each of these days could provide a tiny little perspective shift that might actually change in some little way how the reader lived through that next 24 hours, so that the change might be small, especially at first, but it would be real in the real world, instead of this thing that I have known with so many books, self-help books, personal development books, and experienced as a reader again and again, which is like, you read it and you think that sounds good, and you try to take some notes, and then you think like, someday soon when I get a spare week, I'm really going to put this into practice. and then like there's no such thing as a spare week, so that never happens. I wanted it to be something that could sort of maybe have a little bit of an effect right here and now in the midst of all the, too many emails and scary news headlines and all one's personal problems that one hasn't yet resolved.
Yeah, and I think it's a very, very good time of year to be having this conversation because all around me in London are all the endless, horrible preparations for Christmas, the perfection of Christmas.
Right.
And there's lights everywhere, and there's perfect presents in the shop, and there's money changing hands, and there's just a sort of horrific sense that you're leading up to one of those times of the year when you're meant to be perfect. So I find that your book from the get-go, it says imperfection. And I think that is just the most interesting sort of way of looking at us and how we live. So can you talk about, I know you use the word imperfectionism as a verb, as such, as a sort of way of being.
Yeah, it's sort of just my umbrella term for the outlook that I'm trying to get across in this book. And I suppose imperfectionism plays off against perfectionism, obviously, but I'm sort of working with a very broad definition of perfectionism. So I'm pinpointing definitely that thing in many of us that wants to produce perfect work, or yes, host perfect Christmas
Mm-hmm.
gatherings, but also all sorts of other things that I think can be well understood as perfectionism. The desire to sort of I think people pleasing is a form of perfectionism because it's the desire to exert sort of perfect control over the emotions of everyone around you. Even sort of imposter syndrome can be a kind of perfectionism because it's that inner demand that you feel more qualified and ready for whatever it is you're addressing yourself to than you actually do. I think in all these different ways we're trying to sort of get on top of life, master life, find a way that kind of a sort of set of rules to follow, or just some way of being that makes us feel like we're finally getting our arms around it all, or we finally know really what we're doing, or we finally don't need to worry about what the future might hold. And I guess then imperfectionism is just the approach that says, like, what if we started from the place of knowing that there will always be too much to do, that you'll never fully understand what makes other people tick, that you can't have any confidence about what the future holds. It's just this sort of radically vulnerable but very real and true situation. And basically, I suppose the thing I've got to try to persuade people of is that this is not depressing, and it's also very much a kind of energizing and active way to be in the world, not a resigned and passive one. So that's what I
It's
try to do.
quite a tricky line to draw because you think of going into the shelves of, say, self-help books or stuff, or business books, and they're always how to win, how to conquer. I mean, there's always this sense that your life is permanently a fight. Uh,
Right.
and you approach it from a really different way, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, only from long experience of approaching it that way, which I certainly haven't completely, transcended in any way at all. But um, yeah, I think that because we tell ourselves that there's something that's got to be in position before we can really relax into life, right? We've got to solve your problem with procrastination or distraction, or you've got to figure out how to do your job, or how to really be an effective parent, or whatever, or how to, or that, some people say they've got to get, it's when they get married, when they retire, la la la. Because you're never there, it's always in the
Yeah.
future. Yeah, life is basically a slog towards that point, which never arrives because it would entail being kind of superhuman, really, to have that level of um, security over life. But it's got a big payoff, right? There's a reason we do it, I think, which is that for as long as the big moment of truth is coming later, you don't quite have to reckon with fully with life as it is right now, right? You don't quite have to be here. The language gets a bit difficult at this point, but you don't quite have to fully be here and feel what it's like to be who we are, limited and sort of trapped in the reality that we're in, because you get to tell yourself that later on the real stuff is coming.
Yeah, that's kind of depressing though, isn't it? The sort of idea that you can't appreciate today or right now because something has to happen to
Yeah,
you, or you have to do something,
yeah.
or someone, I think in most people's cases, has to do something. So you can be cross with your boss, or you can be cross with whatever to postpone being just yourself.
Oh yeah, no, it's totally sad. I just think it does. Yeah, it does. It's depressing. It serves that function of um, not giving us the degree of control that I think we wish we had over reality, but leading us on to the notion that we might be about to get it, basically. Yeah.
So in a way, it's a process of letting go of that control.
Yeah, and of seeing that it that control or that quest for that kind of control doesn't bring us the things that we thought it was going to bring. So I refer throughout the book on several occasions to this German social theorist called Hartmut Rosa, who wrote a very big book called Resonance that had
Mm-hmm.
a big effect on me. Its subtitle is A Sociology of Our Relationship to the World. And to cut a 600-page book down to very unfairly down to one sentence, he basically argues that, the ways in which as individuals and as societies, we're always trying to extend the reach of our felt control, uh, which an awful lot of self-help and time management and productivity
Mm-hmm.
advice and all of this really is, right? Um, that this actually has the effect of squeezing out the vibrancy or the resonance, as he calls it, that is the thing that we really value the most in life. That actually you need life to be somewhat outside your control for it to feel um, meaningful, and that when you get to the point where it's, if you ever do, where it's sort of very, very much under your control, all the life is gone from it somehow.
Mm-hmm. How does it work out in your life? Because presumably you write these books for yourself, don't you? I mean, you went on this original quest to understand or to look at
Yeah,
proposals that other people made and bring that your brilliant skeptical eye to them and say, is this worth anything or not? And you also, of course, had a very skeptical readership in the Guardian, which you had to keep going week after week. But so how does something like just the idea of accepting imperfection and accepting the fallibility of life, how does that work out in your life?
I mean, it's just a sort of endless process of having to learn the lessons and have my wife sardonically suggest that I read my own books. I think that um, one it's I can talk about other life domains, but one that I think is always so vivid because I was writing about it and it meant such a lot to me was this kind of this question of how you organize your time, right? So quite relatively early on in my career, I had a lot of autonomy over how I organized a day. Not autonomy over what I did. It didn't feel that way. I had lots and lots of deadlines, but um, you know, once I was not working on a daily basis, there was a lot of freedom to sort of uh do things at the specific times, and like there was, and this was all at the time as well when an awful lot of this stuff was really coming to prominence in books and later YouTube and elsewhere, right? That there might be some silver bullet, some magic bullet way of kind of organizing your day, or the perfect morning routine, or the perfect way of organizing your tasks. And this is still like, I mean, I may have grown disillusioned with it, but this is still like huge industry of promising control over time in this particular
Mm.
way. And yeah, I would discover again and again when I tried to implement these things in my life that either they just didn't work because I was making all these perfectionistic demands over how the day would unfold, and then people got in the way, and I was a jerk to them because I had a plan for the day, and it wasn't what was actually happening. Or more interestingly, perhaps they sometimes did work, as in, you know, I got to sort of go through my life in the ways that I had decided I was going to. And it would just be within about 48 hours, just no fun at all, right? Just sort of completely sapped of any um you know, life or
Mm.
vividness. I mean, I will definitely also say that then parenthood has a very powerful way of uh countering perfectionistic tendencies. Not, I mean, there's a lot of perfectionistic advice given to parents and new parents especially, but in reality, you're sort of in that situation where the the situation of a child is sort of is of growing up or getting older and developing is happening whether you want
Mhm.
it to or not, right? You can't
Mhm.
stop it, pause, figure out the right system, and then implement it. So, I don't think this is an experience unique to parents at all, but there is something that makes it very vivid uh, in that context.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The when we were talking the other day, I was saying that I'm an alcoholic and I'm part of a fellowship, and that's very much about acceptance of, well, this massive, I suppose you'd say, imperfection, which you just learn to live with, and that the big things, I guess, you learn are as well that you can't control people, places, or things. You can only have a small chance of controlling how you react to them. And I think very much through your book that's a very fundamental message that as you if you it's like putting your future happiness on someone else. It
Mm.
tends not to work.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and yeah, we discussed one or two of the overlaps, didn't we, between
Mm.
um, I guess 12-step approaches in general and some of these ideas. And I think one of the, I mean, tell me if this resonates or not, but like there's a psychotherapist called Bruce Tift who I've quoted in
Mm-hmm.
lots of different places, who offers this kind of thought experiment that you take whatever it is in your life that bothers you the most about yourself, like your proneness to anxiety or how easily distracted you are, or your short temper, something like that. And you just sort of entertain the thought of what it would be like to um to know that you were going to be afflicted by some version of this for the rest of your life. You're never
Mm.
going to get over it completely. And for many, many people, that is a very empowering thought because, and the parallel here is obvious, right? With the sort of
Yeah.
12 steps notion that one remains an alcoholic even when one is no longer drinking. And it's actually like once you accept this trait, then you can do something about it. Then you can behave in the ways that you would rather behave. But it's so paradoxical because it first of all first of all begins by this acceptance that you're probably not going to achieve the level of total change that
Well,
you might
yeah,
have wanted to, and it's through that the change is achieved.
the acceptance is powerlessness, and that's
Right.
what's incredibly interesting. And I'm not going to say that it manages to wash over all the other parts of your life, but it certainly helps sometimes in that feeling of not really being able to control things as much as you might like or think
Mhm.
you might like. And that's I mean, I think if you try to control everything, like you were saying, the spontaneity goes out of it. And in fact, everything about a day is made by its surprising bits, quite honestly. It's not made by what you totally expect to happen.
Right. Yeah. No. And that's a point but really also Hartmut Rosa presses home. Right. If
Yeah.
you actually think about, excuse me, if you actually think about all sorts of contexts, if you find it interesting to if you enjoy studying some field of scholarship, say, like obviously that's because you don't understand it all right now. People may claim that they wish they knew in advance that their football team was going to win every single match that they played, but they really wouldn't. It would remove the sort of engaging excitement of that situation. So all sorts of different obvious places where we don't actually want that level of control.
Yeah. I mean, I lived in Kuwait for a couple of years and you get unbelievably bored with having no weather. Anyway,
Right, when you know exactly what it's going to be the
oh
next day,
yeah,
right?
another
Yeah,
hot
yeah.
day. Oh no, where's the
Yeah.
rain? Um, There's some really nice things that I really like. I mean, I'm someone who goes to bed at night and makes a to-do list for the following day because then I can sleep because I feel like I've extracted it from here onto a piece of paper. But you have this really nice idea of having a done list through the day, which is something I'm now doing as a result of reading your book. And it's very cool, actually. Do you do it? So can you explain what you do?
Yeah, I do. I mean, to be really transparent, I use the way I have my stuff organized, it sort of creates it automatically because I move something from one place to another, and then that is the list. But anyway, put this aside. Done list is just any form of list, right, that you keep by recording the things that you do during the day, so that it gets longer as you accomplish them. If you're a real dedicated to-do list user and you stick very religiously to your to-do list, then obviously it's going to look quite a lot like your to-do list because you're just going to be writing those same tasks. But that's fine. I think what's so powerful about this extremely simple practice is just that it reorients the sort of comparison that you're making. We go through life just instinctively comparing what we've done so far today with all the things left to do. And really, that's an infinite supply. Like you might only have a few things left to do on your physical to-do list or your digital to-do list, but the number of things you could do today that would be useful to do today if you had all the time in the world is endless. So when you compare what you've done to that, you always end up feeling depressed and down on yourself because it's, a finite amount compared to an infinite amount. The great thing about the done list is you're sort of implicitly comparing what you've done to if you'd done nothing at all. And therefore you get a much better result. One context in which people find this really useful is if you're in a really sort of low period, if you're in a real sort of rut with your both emotionally and in terms of managing to do anything, you can just write the most basic low-level achievements on this list. Took a shower, made a cup of coffee. No one else ever needs to see this list, right? So, and you can tear it up at the end of the day, whatever. Just that sort of bringing the attention to the way in which you did have some effect on reality, however tiny, took out the bins. It snowballs in a really extraordinary way, and you find very quickly that you're sort of motivated to do slightly larger things as well. I think that it's subtle, isn't it? Because too much control over reality, we've been saying, is undesirable, but having some kind of effect on the world around you is also one of those kind of absolute psychological essentials that people go crazy without.
So you write a lot, quite a lot about making decisions, and that I mean, one of our again going back to one of the things that's actually in Al-Anon in the Just for Today cards is please relieve me from two pests: hurry and indecision. And indecision is also, I think, what you described as procrastination. So you're going and you're kind of, you put something off because, well, lots of reasons which you go into, which I find very interesting. Obviously, I'm sure that I'm picking things up because they appeal to me, and other people would ask you different questions. But you talk about procrastination and how it both protects you and hobbles you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of procrastination seems to sort of mean two things. And in 4,000 Weeks, I wrote a bit about like good procrastination, by which I really mean inevitable procrastination. If there are too many meaningful ways you could spend today for you to do them all, which there always will be, then you're sort of procrastinating on almost everything all the time, right? I mean, if not making progress on something important is what procrastination is, then it's just a condition of our lives. But I think that sort of indecision procrastination is really fascinating because I've certainly spent plenty of time mired in this. There is some feeling that, going back to how we started talking, the discomfort that comes along with sort of consciously feeling what it is to be a finite human, and having limited time, not being able to be sure that anything you produce will be well received or meet your standards or any of that. Like the best way to hold on to that perfect fantasy that it's all going to be perfect is never to begin it in the first place, is to never bring it into reality. You also don't have to take, in fantasy land, you also don't have to take tough decisions about how to spend your time, right? You can sort of harbor plans to spend 6 months a year on meditation retreats while also being a very present friend and parent, while also working 10-hour days. As long as you're just harboring fantasies, no problem. Obviously, when you put them into reality, those don't add up because they're only 24 hours in a day and you have to get some sleep. So there's something really alluring about just sort of hanging out in that not yet committed state, because the thing remains pristine, you know.
Yeah, and it remains still a perfect possibility. So you come up with, I mean, like many people do, about the Robert Frost, you know, the road less traveled.
Yeah.
But I think you make a really wonderful observation after that, is that actually we choose roads all the time. I mean, every day we're making kind of decisions that could alter what happens, and that if you went to one room, you might bump into someone, you might not, and that we put too much emphasis on that. It's slightly how I read it. A feeling it's a kind of what if feeling.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I feel like because every moment is a decision or a choice, whether we consciously decide or not, there is this sense in which the idea that the things that we can see as decisions and then get stressed about because we're taking them, like, actually you can cut them down to size and see that that's all just being more conscious about how you were living anyway. The bit where I write about the Robert Frost poem, based on the interpretation of that by the American poet David Orr, I had filed that famous poem away. It's possible that not everyone in the 5x15 audience knows about it. If you were American, or if you are American, you will, because it's sort of like drummed into Americans in high school, whether they like it or not. But it's the one about two paths diverging in a wood, and the speaker of the poem says, you know, I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And I had filed this away, like everybody, or like most people, as a kind of rather cliched argument for going your own way and following a beat of a different drum, and, you know, always doing the unconventional thing and not going with the crowd. But David Orr shows that if you really read this, and I won't like do it line by line here because it's not the point, but if you really see what he's doing, it's very quickly apparent that what Frost may at least really be saying instead is that, you know, sure, we may justify our decisions in hindsight by saying, I did the unconventional thing, but really at every moment of our lives, we're making decisions, not only where we can't know which one is going to be the right one in advance, but we can't even know in hindsight, because who knows, right? Even if you consider your life to be wonderfully happy, like maybe there's some way it could have been happier. Even if you consider your life to be a tragedy, maybe there's some way it could have been more tragic. So we're just sort of flying blind to a degree that we don't like to admit.
Yeah, I think it's, as an expression, slightly been hijacked by the what if brigade. You know, if only, the if onlys. You know, if only I had done this, or I hadn't done that, or I had done this, I had done that. That is a very not great way to assess what's going on around you. I mean, I'm someone who used to do that a lot. And then I married a lawyer, and he would say, just stop that. I deal with that every day in court. Someone going, oh, if only I hadn't murdered my wife, or, you know, whatever it is.
Right, yes.
And you suddenly think, okay, this, just get on and deal with whatever the reality is in front of you.
Right, and also just like butting in, I don't necessarily think this applies to murderers, but there is it sort of cuts regret down to size as well, doesn't it? Because it sort of makes it clear that you're going to regret things.
Absolutely.
And that's not avoidable. And in its non-avoidability, there's a kind of freedom.
Yes, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. So there's lots of really nice things. I love the stuff about your list of books by the bed. I'm guilty of that one. Of course, I picked this out again. That it isn't meant to oppress. You're meant to see it like a river.
I just suggest in this, it's a very sort of vivid form of a much wider phenomenon, right? That we have all these sort of infinite or effectively infinite inputs in our lives that we drive ourselves a bit crazy trying to fully deal with the whole of. And the to read pile or the list of articles in your read it later app or whatever the equivalent is, it feels like, the metaphor I use, it feels like a bucket, it feels like something where something accumulates and it's your job to sort of empty it out. But this makes no sense when you think about the supply being as unlimited as it is. And so the alternative is, to think of it as a river, to think of all this information flowing by you, and you're standing by the banks or perhaps in the middle of the river, picking out things as they flow by that catch your attention or that seem particularly worth your time, but not with some background agenda that you're going to consume the whole river, I suppose, to push this metaphor too far. And it's funny because I do feel sort of oppressed by or I can do, by the list of bookmarks in my browser, right? And yet nobody feels oppressed by all the books in the British Library. You don't sit at home at night feeling bad that you haven't got through all of those. It's just a question of where we draw the mental boundary and then beat ourselves up on one side of it.
But there's so many. I mean, I'm victim of this. There's so many interesting things to read. You're just. I mean, there is just always this feeling of there's yet another paper about food or climate change that I should be reading.
I think another metaphor here that really made a big difference to me, but that you just reminded me of in the way you expressed that, is that it's possible to approach lists and lists of things to read and mental lists of books to catch up on and all the rest of it as menus. In fact, it probably makes a lot more sense to approach them as menus.
That's good.
You go to a restaurant, or especially if you go to one of those like New York diners where they hand you like a lever arch file of all the dishes that they claim they can prepare. Nobody in their right minds would feel bad, I think, maybe I'm wrong, that you have to make a choice from that list, right? That the whole point is there's this abundant world of things to pick from. And so in a sort of slightly cliched self-helpy thing, it's not like a to-do list that you have to get through. It's a menu that you get to choose from. And I think you can approach information overload and a lot of other things in life like this. Honestly, if we're finite and there's an infinite amount of stuff to do, then all lists are menus anyway. And we sort of might as well take that attitude, I guess.
Yeah. Well, on that sort of question of finiteness, I find that you have somewhere in that thing about figuring out what you say no to. And I think that people's problems about saying no are huge. And that, I mean, I have a small rule, which is where I try to do it, don't do anything in 6 months' time, because you agreed to do something in 6 months because it's so far away. Don't agree to anything that you wouldn't want to do tomorrow morning.
That's a very wise.
I mean, when you can do it, it really helps sort of filter something out. But of course, you don't do it for reasons to do with because it makes you feel better or whatever it is. So, do you think that there is a good strategy? Well, in fact, your book is not really so much about strategy; it's about learning how to do things that give you back your life force, I suppose, is what, because some things you feel in the flow and some things you feel you're just scratching along.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's that wonderful line that I've quoted a few times from James Hollis, the Jungian therapist, about asking whether a choice enlarges or diminishes you, as a way of just intuitively connecting to, like, is this the way of is there life in this choice, or is it kind of not? I think when it comes to saying no, I mean, you make a great point about how the sort of telescoping the time in terms of saying no to things you don't want to do. Understanding that, that trick is golden, I think. There's a lovely line that I've quoted from Elizabeth Gilbert, who makes the point that actually the real problem is saying no to things you do want to do. For almost all of us in, most walks of life, there are going to be more things that you do want to do or would like to pursue than there is time available to pursue them. And that's harder because then you're in the realm of thinking, well, this is 6 months away. Would I want to do it tomorrow? Yes, I would. But maybe still I have to find a way to say no, because just for, just the maths of the situation, that there are other things that I want to do more that I can't have in my life if I'm always doing this other kind of thing. I think there's something quite, I mean, this is a point that occurs in lots of different forms in this book, right? But there's something quite freeing about seeing that it's worse than you think, as it were, right? There's something quite freeing about seeing that you're going to have to say no to a lot of things you would like to do, as well as a lot of things that you don't want to do. There's no way to win here and do all the things that you want to do.
That's
And if there's no way to win, then you don't need to fight that fight, right? I mean,
that's true, but it is different from. I mean, it's different from, say, having slightly lower expectations, because then the chances are you'd always be kind of pleased and surprised. There's something different about that kind of acceptance, I think.
But there's something, yeah, there's something. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but yeah, there's a form of. I mean, I come at this from so many different angles to try to get it across, and one of them is a line from a writer whose work I admire a lot, called Sasha Chapin, and he uses this phrase, "playing in the ruins," and he talks about how there's a different context, but he talks about how he really wanted to be a sort of famous novelist, and when he realized it wasn't going to work out, he was able no longer to actually be. He was able to be the writer that he could be, and to enjoy the process, because he was no longer trying to make reality match up to something that was actually not in the stars for him. And I think it's a bit of the same when it comes to FOMO and trying to do all the things that feel like they need doing, or meet all our obligations, because it's not always fun, right? Once you see how impossible it is, the thing that we've been trying to do, like, there's new energy to actually more playfully in the ruins do the things that we can do. I don't know if that conveys it, but it's another way into the same stuff, maybe.
Slightly diverting, but I guess all these things come around to the same thing.
They do, I think, anyway.
The question of the gnawing rat, the canoeing rat, however you say that. Yeah, I mean, we all have that. I mean, one of the great things about reading this book is, I suppose, you realize that everyone has fundamentally got all the same insecurities and worries and gnawing rats hanging around their shoulders that you have. But you have some rather good advice about that gnawing.
Yeah, this needs to be attributed to a Dutch Zen writer called Paul Lumens, whose
Don't
work
be too modest.
made a big impression on me. Well, I'm adapting it and synthesizing it and putting it in a wider context. But anyway, the imagery is the idea of the gnawing rat.
It's really good.
And what this refers to is those kind of tasks that, or indeed whole areas of life that one avoids taking action on because they trigger some kind of anxiety. So this is the classic situation where you feel a pain that you probably ought to get the doctor to look at, but precisely because it could be something serious, you don't go to the doctor, or you're worried that you don't have as much money in your current account than you feel you ought to have, or thought you had, so you don't check the balance, because then you don't need to confront this fact. And of course, this is a disastrous way of operating, because if you haven't got enough money, seeing the truth of that is the first step to doing something about it. If the pain is something serious, getting it checked out is the first step to resolving it, right? It's obviously, you should be turning towards these things, but it's absolutely not, normal for us not to. And there's a certain kind of cliched self-help piece of advice that says, like, you've just got to sort of man up or woman up and, like, push through and force yourself to do these things, and it's all going to be a big fight. Lumens has this idea that actually all you need to do is, as he puts it, befriend your gnawing rats. You need to take any kind of action, even a purely internal mental action, that just sort of acknowledges that they are already a part of your reality. It could be as easy as visualizing the first step you would take to make the doctor's appointment or to check the balance. He gives this example of a woman who'd become completely sort of pathologically stressed out about a shed full of junk that she hadn't been into and desperately needed to sort of
Mhm.
clear out. And his advice there is like, just go to the shed, just stand in the space. And it's extraordinary when you sort of let these, we actually put so much effort into sort of trying to deny the fact that some particular problem, some gnawing problem is a part of our reality. We'd rather imagine that it wasn't. That as soon as you do anything to just like accept that it's there, lots of the other steps follow quite
Mhm.
intuitively and naturally, and don't need that kind of daily effort to sort of force yourself, which is absolutely no fun and sort of a disincentive to action.
So it is the Adam Phillips quote that you have about, treating oneself with compassion. Um, Very much is, I think, kind of comes out of that as well. And it is that thing that if it was a friend of yours who was saying, I'm so fearful of my bank account, I daren't look, you would say, actually, it's probably a really good idea to have a look. That's the kind
Right. And
of
yeah,
self
it's
you
almost
give.
like, yeah. It's like taking, it sounds all levels of cliched, I know, but it's like, it's like taking yourself by the hand and just sort of gently leading yourself to the first step. It's how you would work with a toddler.
But,
But Phillips is totally right. Like if you, yeah, the way we berate ourselves instead, if
mm,
you met the person doing that berating in a social context, you just think like,
where does that come from? That human impulse to kind of go to yourself, I could do better, I could do better, I could try harder. I really screwed that one up. And you what you remember is the things you got kind of quotes wrong, rather than again the things you'd put on your done list. The camera's done it again, which are quite good. Why do we have a human instinct to find the not good? And
I mean, the why of it is so is I think we could sort of discuss endlessly, and I'm sure that the sort of psychoanalytic answer would be at least in part to do with the ways in which we're, you know, imperfectly and insufficiently parented, and the fact that we feel like we've got to try to sort of earn a level of uh, acceptance or love or belonging that we don't feel that we have by birthright. But then you've got all the sort of social and economic pressures that
Mhm.
really make it feel like you have to drive yourself harder if you're going to keep your head above water. And I think I would say if you go right back to fundamentals on some level, all of this is just an unease with being finite, with being mortal, right? It's this sort of feeling that if we really push ourselves to be better and different, we could somehow uh, forestall the fate that um, awaits us. I think there's something really powerful in that notion that we'll fight and berate ourselves and make life completely miserable to do anything for a sort of to sustain this fantasy that if we finally get to the place it's all aimed at, suddenly, at that point, we might not have to, experience what we actually do all have to experience as finite human beings.
Would die basically.
Yeah, and all the things that follow from that,
Yeah,
like having a limited amount of time, and
yeah.
yes, I mean it's all capped by death. Yeah.
So we're going to come to the questions in a minute, but we haven't yet talked about the great big new elephant in the room, which is social media, and of course the hideous comparisons that it makes all the time, and the fact that, and I know we talked about this a bit before, but the kind of the way the economy, the capitalist economy. I mean, I was saying to you, you can no longer buy a shampoo for normal hair. You're berated all the time that you could do better for
Mhm.
yourself by
Yeah.
buying this, investing in this, by losing weight, but whatever it is, or taking this course, and that we're completely sealed in a world where, well, you're not all right. I mean, and you're somehow morally responsible to yourself. I mean, I in South America, for instance, you can get bank loans to have nose jobs, and they're seen in exactly the same way as, say, you could get a bank loan, for university. So this is seen as a step on the career ladder. So it's telling you, I'm not okay, and I
Yeah.
should be better, and it's madly exacerbated now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and yeah, the economic system that we live in has an obvious sort of vested interest in kindling dissatisfaction and then promising but not delivering the solution to it. And obviously, self-help is one very vivid version of that, because it's so sort of overt. It's like, this book will solve your problems, and then if it did, then that would be a bad business model for the people putting those books out. I think all the same that yeah, these are things that are really, that technology and the attention economy and the rest of it is able to exacerbate greatly. But that dissatisfaction, that sense that something isn't right and needs to be fixed before we can really relax into our lives is much older than any of that. And it's part of the core of what, Buddhism, to name one world religion, is about. That notion of like, there's some problem that has to be solved here before you can really consider yourself to fully be here. And what changes when we start to ask wonder if maybe life isn't a problem to be solved. And that, quoting Charlotte Jocko Beck, the American Zen teacher, as I quote at the beginning of 4,000 Weeks, it's possibly true that, as she puts it, what makes it unbearable is your mistaken belief that it can be cured. And when you relax the idea that there must be a cure to all of this, then the need for a cure to it all seems to evaporate. Anyway.
Well, that's really interesting. I think that is I mean, you can sort of take the 1960s expression, get laid back, chill out, but there was a kind of ground of truth in there. And in fact, I've got a question here: what role does Zen practice play in your thinking? Because a lot of that kind of thinking did derive from religions like Zen, if you call it a way of thinking, rather.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think I feel very sort of journalistic in the way that I approach these books. So I sort of plunder from anywhere if it's useful for the thing I'm doing. But Zen is one tradition that over and over again seems to have found ways of expressing what I'm exploring and sort of pushing it to the next level. I have a sort of patchy, undisciplined history with actual sort of seated meditation, but Zen specifically in Buddhism, to me, it seems, does this very ingenious thing where it takes people like me, and perhaps many people here tonight, who are sort of intellect first people, who sort of think they can go through life using their brain, their minds to figure things out, sort of, liable to be brains on sticks, or stalks, as some people sometimes say, and not so good at the embodied aspects of life. But then, instead of just telling them that that's a bad way to live, Zen and things like koans in Zen, they almost like, they say, well, okay, let's take this as far as it can go. Let's really bring thinking to bear on reality. And if you take it far enough, it's sort of, I don't know if this is going to sound clear to anyone who doesn't already know what I'm talking about, but if you take that far enough, it kind of, something crumbles, something sort of collapses in the attempt to get your mind around reality. And there's something very, very liberating and deep about that collapse, and you're sort of delivered on the other side of it to a more to a fuller participation in reality. But
Oh, I love
as
that.
that came out of my mouth, it sounded very cryptic. So
no, it didn't. I mean, I don't know if you could. I mean, the Zen koan that I love is about the tiger. The tiger's racing. Someone's being chased by a tiger. They get to a cliff and they start climbing down the cliff, and they hang on to a tree, and then slowly the tree starts to fall away, and the drop is huge, and up above the tiger's roaring, and the person doesn't know what to do, and then he looks over to his left and he sees a strawberry, and he reaches out and picks the strawberry. And it's,
right,
you think, oh, okay, I don't get that, but I can kind of get that. And it does crumble the walls.
yeah, no, it yeah, or pulls a rug from out from under something. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. So there's another question here about practical strategies to tackle the anxiety that perfectionism brings, i.e., how to remind oneself that flaws are okay. But I don't know if that's the right word, flaws, because actually it's humanity, isn't it? It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we use lots of negative expressions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's fascinating that yeah, I mean, even imperfectionism could be accused of being a sort of smuggling in a pejorative judgment. I think this depends in terms of practical strategies. I think this depends very much on what you're doing. The specific activity where you are sort of haunted by perfectionism. So forgive me if I just give an example from writing because it's what I know. But as I write in the book, one of the things I sort of encountered I got down to a new level of perfectionistic uh, weirdness in myself writing this book, and had to sort of figure out how to grapple with it, and started really for the first time in my career doing these kinds of free writing exercises where you set a timer and just write anything for a certain period of time, which I had always deeply disdained as like the thing that amateur writers did, and I was a professional, and I wasn't going to do any of this nonsense like you know uh exercises. I just get down to work and do the thing. Um, but actually, I was astonished by how difficult I found it to sort of allow myself to just make a total mess onto the page, um, and how that sort of exposed what I'd been doing before as quite perfectionistic, where you sort of sit and wait until you can think of something good to write. A very agonizing way to do things. So really, that was about just, again, taking oneself by the hand and leading oneself through these very elementary exercises in doing things badly or doing things far from perfectly, or however you want to phrase it. Just doing that for 10 minutes into a file that you then delete. Nobody else ever needs to see it. And yet the sort of emotional journey that you go on if you're a real perfectionist, through just actually allowing that to take place, is quite something gets sort of metabolized or something in that process that is very useful. Now, whether that will transfer to areas other than writing, I don't know, but that was what came to my mind.
There's a question here about taking time for yourself, given that that's seen as a bit self-indulgent, without it having an impact on your interpersonal relationships. There's expectations today that we're always available, that we can't.
Yeah.
And I mean, on the back of that question, I'd also like to ask you a bit about wasting time. I mean, again, that's another horrible way of looking at time, and that we sort of despise it. She's a time waster, and it's derogatory. But how do you take time for yourself? Is it a valid thing to do?
I mean, I find the concept, it's really interesting because I found for a long time that if I sort of tried to build in time for myself in that sense and think of it in those terms, it didn't work. Either because it was too easy to give way and give that time to other people instead, or because on the occasions that it did work and you had like 2 hours that you'd sort of ring fenced just for yourself, like I was just at a loss about what to do with it. The flywheel of wanting to sort of get everything done and keep everyone happy is so powerful that it feels just like not fun. I think on reflection, there's something that needs to be questioned in that notion of time for oneself that implicitly defines all the rest of time as not being for yourself, right? As being for serving other people. And I don't mean that people aren't in situations where that is how it goes, right? I mean, where your job or your family, all sorts of things could just feel like they take every single moment. But I think it's important at least to aspire to an outlook on life that would not see that as a zero-sum game, right? Where if what you are doing at this point in your reality and your life is raising a family, you don't want to get to the point where you think of all the time spent on that as not being for yourself. Some of it might involve a lot of sacrifices, but you don't want to define it from the start as as not being for yourself, because that almost suggests some sort of failure to fully internalize the fact that this is a choice you have made at this season of your life. So I'm sort of thinking that through. I think it's very important to, build in time when what you're doing is taking a walk or what you're doing is reading a novel. And there's endless evidence to show that that will make you better at doing all the other things. But I think it would be quite helpful to question the notion that we're dividing time into for ourselves and for others, as if that's a dichotomy we have to only be on one side of.
Yeah, and it is that you deserve time for yourself, as though you didn't quite deserve the rest of it. You're quite right. It makes life seem like the other part of life is not so great.
Right.
So,
And I've caught myself in this, right? It's like there are definitely times when the specific things one has to do as a parent of a young child are not particularly pleasant. Sure. But it's really self-defeating to approach that time intrinsically as being somehow a distraction or an interruption to time for oneself. Yeah.
you want your life to feel congruent. I'm not sure if that was a word that Chogyam Rinpoche used to use, who you quote, who was an absolutely crazy Tibetan guru who I crossed paths with many years ago. But he was very interesting about imperfection, and he would always say, you don't want to give things up. You want to use them as the manure in which to grow new things. It was it's quite a helpful thing that you can turn the energies around inside you to make them less destructive or more destructive. And that they were. Anyway, we are up to the time. I'm afraid it's gone by so fast. I've got reams of other things to ask you. But there's a really nice, on page 146, because I'm not quite sure which chapter we're in, there's a really wonderful quote from a woman who, you got the book with you?
I have.
I was wondering whether you could read it. It's a woman who lost a child, and about how life came back to her, what brought her peace. It's very beautiful.
Sure. There's a quote in the middle of this from a Zen teacher called John Tarrant.
Yeah.
So I'll start by reading something I wrote, but then I think it's clear, because it says Tarrant writes, but yeah. So this is somebody, right, of his acquaintance going through the most harrowing thing it's possible to conceive of, if one can even conceive of it, if it hasn't happened to you. And found a woman who found herself unable to wrap her mind around what had happened. Well-intentioned friends sought to help her recover a sense of meaning in life, but meaning was nowhere to be found. Indeed, trying to find purpose after such a calamity only seemed to make things worse. What eventually brought a modicum of peace and the first stirrings of forward motion was the woman's realization that a stable sense of meaning, a clear grasp of what was happening to her, might be things that didn't need finding after all. Tarrant writes, she accepted that her life was now outside anything she had ever imagined. There was no reason for living. And at the same time, there was no reason why she couldn't survive or feel joy. She had to live merely for the sake of life, without justifications or achievements. She found that she was willing to do this. It also came to her that taking this path was generous to her daughter. And I mean, not to unpack it too much, and I know we've got to stop, but I think there's something very deep there that applies in far less calamitous situations, right? That this need to try to get things figured out and to get on top of things in that way can be a real impediment to actually entering fully and wholeheartedly into them.
Yeah, I didn't find it catastrophic. I found it very joyous, actually, that you just live life because it's in front of you.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinarily magical, if you allow it to be, which means you have to slightly let it go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. As I say, there's so much more in this book. We haven't even begun to cover all the different extraordinary ideas and really, really good ideas. And sorry, you probably got very much my one side of it because, of course, as I said before, you all feel that Oliver's writing entirely for you. But thank you so much for your time. And as I say, Christmas is coming, and this is a really good book to read as we run up to this tough time of year. And also to a Christmas present, I would say. So, Oliver, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. And I hope we see you.
Thank you, Rosie. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you, everyone who's been here tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay.